there's $29 billion in this bill for the National Science Foundation. So don't you think the American people deserve to know where their money's being spent? This is over $800,000 to study whether or not Japanese quail are more sexually promiscuous on cocaine. This study is about Panamanian male frog calls. So they have about $500,000, and they wanted to know whether or not the male mating call is different in the country than it is in the city. And we also found that they spent $30,000 studying Ugandan gambling habits. We spent about $500,000 on a video game. This is an app for your phone. I know we all need things to do when we should be working or at school. This is an app for school children to teach them alarmism over climate change. A couple of years ago, they gave money for autism, $700,000 for autism. You think, well, autism, even myself, as conservative as I am, I could probably say, well, that's something we ought to study, autism. Well, they subcontracted $700,000 of it to a bunch of egghead researchers to watch Neil Armstrong's statement on the moon. You remember the black and white photo? He's on the moon, and he says, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, or did he really say one small step for a man? So these researchers took $700,000 to listen to that crackly old cassette recording and find out, did he say man or did he say a man? So we studied the preposition a, and we spent $700,000 listening to the tape over and over and over again. And you know what they determined? They just can't decide. They're unsure, but they did recommend more money to study the problem further. We should not be giving these people more money. We should be giving them dramatically less money. I think we ought to have a taxpayer advocate. Could we not have just someone with a good dose of common sense that says we shouldn't take autism money, steal it, and spend it on a bunch of idiots listening to what Neil Armstrong said when he landed on the moon? They wanted to know if you take a selfie of yourself while smiling and you look at it later in the day, will that make you happy? Really? That's $500,000. I don't think we need a scientist to say that that's BS and the government's got no business doing this kind of research. I don't even know how you can even call this research with a straight face. So we're now increasing their budget by 68% despite this kind of research. We spent $1.5 million studying lizards on a treadmill. So I know you've all been curious. When lizards walk and they kind of waddle and they have a funny walk, why do they walk that way? What's going on in their knee joints? What do their hip joints look like when they waddle across the lawn? Everybody wants to know that, but are you willing to spend $1.5 million of your taxpayer dollars to take x-rays, live, real-time x-rays of a lizard walking on a treadmill? I tend to think, maybe Alzheimer's research, maybe cancer research, maybe heart research, but spending good, hard cash on x-rays of a lizard on a treadmill do not strike me as the most pressing concerns of government.
We gotta follow the science. We gotta trust the science. Listen to the scientists, because they know best.
Then strangled them, and finally dismembered their bodies.
Right.
Then
Available.
and homelessness and all that. And now, the voice you've been waiting for.
There is a secret song at the center of the world, and its sound is like razors through flesh. I'm here to turn up the volume.
60 years ago, right as Eisenhower was leaving office and Kennedy was about to come in, he gave his final address where he issued a few warnings to us for what was coming up in the future.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
Seems like we totally failed at that one. It wasn't too long after that the national security state used its unaccountability and total lack of transparency to start doing all kinds of shit behind our backs, overthrowing countries, meddling in elections left and right, and claiming that it's for our interest when none of it seemed to work out to our benefit. The military-industrial complex became the driving force. Most people know about that, but a lot of people forget about the second part of the warning.
The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded. Yet in holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific, technological elite.
The scientific and technological elite, the eggheads that have taken over, and they tell us things that turn out to be bullshit. They get paid off by titans of industry. I mean, you realize that the whole demonizing fat is what's causing people to be unhealthy thing was actually paid for by the companies that produced the sugary snacks. They decided to demonize fat, which is something that you need because that's what your brain is made of, and your body doesn't produce fat, so for your brain to replenish those cells, you need to intake fat. Instead, they said, no, sugar's not a problem, it's the fat you need to worry about. And then later, it's actually the saturated fat. And then later, actually, it's the trans fat. People seem to forget that scientists are people, human beings. They're fallible. They can be corrupted, they could be bought off, they could be blackmailed. They could just be dumb as fuck. Even doctors. You go into a doctor's office and he has that nice diploma hanging on his wall, but how do you know he wasn't the stupidest motherfucker to graduate from that program? You don't know what kind of grades he got. You don't even know what he was taught. You just assume that he's an expert, that he can't make a mistake, or he can't, be not telling you something because he doesn't want to rock the boat of the accepted medical establishment. You just assume, he's my doctor and I trust him. Well, it's not necessarily about trust. He only knows what he got taught. Even if he does know better, he might keep his mouth shut because it could get him into trouble saying something that runs afoul of the American Medical Association. His license to practice medicine could be at risk. So all too often they go with the grain. They don't want to, upset the apple cart. This is why having centralized power in something like the CDC or the FDA or the World Health Organization might not be such a great idea. If you'll remember at the beginning of the pandemic, the reason why the cases got so bad to begin with is because nobody could even test. And while the CDC was saying we don't have a problem here, people in states weren't allowed to get tested unless you had just come from China or had been in contact with somebody that was already a confirmed case. If you tried to go get tested, back in February or early March, they just wouldn't do it because they'd say, no, there's no chance. Turned out they were all wrong. And the reason why you couldn't, even if your doctor thought maybe, this could be COVID, they couldn't test you for it because they weren't allowed to. The CDC had to approve all of the tests. Having that centralized top-down command structure isn't necessarily a good idea. You've got the World Health Organization, which is the centralized World UN Health Committee, and they basically make the decisions for everybody because the CDC would just take their nods from whatever the fuck they were saying. And it turned out that they were covering up for China all along. I mean, most people knew it right at the beginning and tried to speak out about it, and they got heavily censored. For a year, if you so much as suggested that the virus could have come from a lab in Wuhan, then you would get erased. They would pull down your shit, and if you kept it up, they would erase you in your account from social media. You would be depersoned. And now all of a sudden, after a year of telling us that that was completely debunked, it got undebunked. 2 weeks ago, if I sat here and said, there's a good possibility that that virus came out of a lab, this shit would have got pulled down. I could have been kicked off of Facebook, Twitter, whatever. But now all of a sudden, it's safe to say it because Fauci and the central people at the FDA and CDC said it was okay to say it. But 2 weeks ago, I would have been just as right as I am today to say it, but you weren't allowed to. Why? Because of that centralized top-down command structure. And they're still trying to hedge what they're saying and oh, well, see, we have now, we can't discount it, but we still lean heavily towards it being from a natural source. But there was never any evidence of that, other than that's what the Chinese said. Literally, they never found the host animal. It took them 4 months to find the host animal that started the SARS. It took them 9 months to track down the camels that started the MERS. To this day, they haven't found the single fucking natural source of this supposed horseshoe bat, or for a while they said pangolins, but they can't find any proof. There's no proof. And from the beginning they said, no, it's totally just a coincidence that it just so happened that this pandemic started right down the street from a fucking lab where they do testing on the exact same virus. And the World Health Organization didn't just go along with the nonsense about it coming from a wet market. They actually said the Chinese are doing such a great job with their transparency and openness and their handling of all this. And the only proof was that the Chinese government fucking said so. I mean, what do you think? You're gonna say, hey, did you guys have a little boo-boo and cause a pandemic that's gonna, make millions of people die? Of course they're not gonna fess up to it. Of course they're not gonna say, yeah, sorry about that, my bad. And after a year, when the World Health Organization finally sent people in to investigate the origins, they came back and said, no, it didn't come from a lab. We investigated, and there's no evidence of that. It definitely didn't. No. But their investigation consisted of them going to the lab and asking them. They spent 3 hours in the lab, and they said, hey, this pandemic that's killed millions of people worldwide, is that you guys' fault? And the people in the lab said, nope, not us. And the investigators said, well, good enough for me. It was a year ago that Trump came out in a press conference and said that he had intelligence that showed that it's very probable that it came from a lab leak. And they shat all over him mercilessly. Headlines, oh, Fauci just crushed Trump's conspiracy theory about a lab leak. And now, look at where we are. Turns out that was pretty fucking credible, which anybody that was paying attention to what was going on knew that to begin with. But now, all of a sudden, it's okay to say that. And there's still a lot of other things that you can't say, or even say, I think this might be a possibility, or you'll get depersoned. Your shit'll get erased, and they will take you down off of social media. Is that really the way we want to go? I mean, it just came out that Facebook was censoring content not based on whether or not it was true, but whether or not it would make people hesitant to take the vaccine. So what do we do about that? I mean, one good idea would be turning Facebook into the next MySpace and going somewhere that's not going to censor content and use algorithms to mold our national consensus on what we believe and think. I mean, we don't need a new law to pass it. We just need to start exercising critical thinking and discernment. It's not that fucking hard. I mean, the TV news, they're under no obligation to tell you the truth. They can lie by omission. They can know they're full of shit because they're not giving you the whole story. And what are you going to do? It's not against the law. You don't need to do anything but understand that they're not there to tell you the truth. Part of the problem is you just don't learn critical thinking or self-awareness in school. You learn to memorize and recite dates and facts and names. In essence, they're conditioning you. They're not educating you. And they're turning you into a parrot. A parrot can hear something and then repeat it back. But it's definitely not the smartest bird. They'll hear things, repeat it back to you, and it almost sounds like there's a human brain in there. But there's not. It doesn't even understand what it's saying. And that's what they're turning children into. In school, they don't encourage individuality or critical thinking or questioning anything. You're just taught to obey. Obey authority, be subordinate, and memorize and recite. That's not thinking, and that's why they keep churning out generations of kids that don't know how to look at things with discernment. It's not too late to learn. You just have to learn that, people aren't always telling you the truth, and when something doesn't make sense, maybe you should dig a little bit deeper. Some of that critical thinking is really going to come in handy with this upcoming UFO disclosure that the Pentagon was ordered to do. After all these years of treating people like they're nutcases for saying that they saw these crafts flying in a way that's inconsistent with what we know about physics and aviation, now they're saying, oh, well, it turns out that it wasn't bullshit all along. And they're about to give a report to Congress about this. You should keep in mind that back in 1951, they passed a law where they could suppress new technologies, under national security, of course. And it was supposed to be only for a certain period of time, but there's a clause in there that says if we're at war, they can indefinitely keep this secret from the public. And what do you know? We have been at war. You think when we pull out of Afghanistan in September that it's going to be the end of our longest war? Wrong. Not unless we're also going to be pulling out of Korea, because that war technically never ended. So, because we've technically been in a state of war since the 50s, they've been able to keep secret technology secret for all this time. So maybe those technologies were some of the UFOs that we're supposedly seeing and not space aliens. Just something to think about. I'm not saying aliens don't exist. I'm just saying that just because there's UFOs, they're not necessarily space aliens. UFO just means unidentified flying object. It doesn't mean extraterrestrial. It just means they can't identify it. Or if they can, they refuse to disclose that publicly. But there's all kinds of technologies that have been kept secret from us. And if you think they're about to disclose everything, sadly mistaken. It's going to be what's known as a limited hangout, where it's become so blatant that they're full of shit when they say this stuff doesn't exist that they're gonna admit to a little bit of it to try to salvage a little bit of trust. But just remember that the national security state has never and will never tell us everything. One other thing I wanted to talk about. The news broke this week that after a little bit of a hiatus, Kevin Spacey's coming back. And it's sad because I really liked him as an actor. I like a lot of the movies that he's been in. Then he got Me Too'd, accused of sexually assaulting multiple males, some of them underage. And then, mysteriously, a number of them just up and died. Now, he's coming back to the big screen to play, from what I understand, a falsely accused sexual predator. How sick is that? It's the kind of sick irony like Brian Williams getting fired from NBC for lying about what happened, claiming that he was in a helicopter that came under fire, and when he got caught being full of shit, he went away for a little while, and then he comes back to MSNBC, and now he's got a show where he fact-checks fake news. And all kinds of people on the news are full of shit. Nobody seems to notice, nobody seems to care. They just swallow it hook, line, and sinker. All we have to do is just start asking questions, refuse to just buy what they're selling, or at least exercise a little bit of discernment. Sláinte.
All I have in this world is my thoughts and my word, and I don't break them for no one. You understand? So say good night to the bad guy. 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 Come on. Come on. night. So say good night. So say good night to the bad guy. I told you, don't fuck with me. 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 You stupid fuck. Look at you now. Look at you now.